Before I start my talk, I would like to provide a little bit of context for what I'm going to talk about. I have been involved in, like a conversation on animal protection, animal dignity, animal ethics in general for almost like 2 decades since I started my graduate work. And I totally believe that well, Islam is a tradition. It's a very, very complex tradition. I would say the Quran, at least, does not embrace the principle of human exceptionalism. Humans, in my own reading of the Quran, are not exceptional in any way. Of course, like the Quran speaks a lot about humans and is deeply preoccupied by humans. There is no denying of this. But this is because also the Quran is a message to humans. It's not a message to other creatures. So the fact that the Quran emphasizes the theme of humans more than any other creature it's because it is a message. It is hudan linnas, guidance for humankind. So I am totally convinced that the Quran promotes a very, very egalitarian message. Humans are not better than other creatures. The only thing that makes a creature better or worse is spirituality. It is, in fact, obedience to God, faith in and obedience to God. And it seems that the Quran affirms that non-human creatures are actually a lot more obedient to God than the average human being, right? So, it says that every creature has already submitted to God, Aslam. And what is the Quran? It is a message that is inviting humankind to submit themselves to God. So we're simply invited to join the rest of creation in being Muslim, in being, in surrendering our will to God. So I do believe in this, but also I see, like, in the animal rights tradition, in at least in the Western context, most advocates of animal rights would argue that killing for food is not justified. Like, how can you claim that you're equal to other creatures while also killing them? It does, like, initially, in fact, on the surface, it does appear like a paradox, right? And there are many scholars on Islam, Muslim and non-Muslim, who have argued the same. Like they try to build a case for vegetarianism in Islamic tradition. I do not accept this dimension of the debate. My own view is that it is quite important for humans to fill their ecological niche, like any other creature that is out there. That's one thing. In any case, the theme of vegetarianism actually raises many problems which are subject of profound debate, hard debate in the secular tradition in Western discourse, but it has not been tackled yet in, among those who work on animal ethics in Islam. So this is what my conversation or my presentation today is about, like whether there is a way of building a case for vegetarianism in Islam or not. And obviously, I think you have already guessed that I will argue that against this idea. I don't think there is actually a case for vegetarianism, although there's plenty of room for improvement, obviously, in the way we deal with non-human animals. So, I will discuss in particular three works that have, tried to build a case for vegetarianism in Islam. So, three notable attempts to build the case for vegetarianism in Islam have appeared in the last couple of decades. Richard Faltz, in 2004, appeals to Islamic doctrines and other principles to argue that the vegetarian lifestyle is not totally incompatible with Islamic creed. Catherine Perlow, in 2009, invokes mainly the principle of moral progress to show how world religions, including Islam, can abandon killing for food. So humanity was less moral, it's becoming more moral, and now because we're becoming better, we can give up killing. Finally, Kisha Ali, in 2015, engages feminist theory to argue that misogyny and carnivorism are underlain by the same exploitative presuppositions and to derive an Islamic premise countering the permissibility of killing for food. Although these discussions address legitimate grievances and highlight many problematic aspects of Muslims' attitudes toward non-human animals, they also suffer from methodological flaws and mischaracterize and oversimplify the tradition. Moreover, they hardly apply any critical scrutiny to the animal rights discourse. You know, like the animal rights discourse is taken as the main authority. You know, it is a human discourse that is also open for, discussion. So the aim of this presentation is to consider not only whether a case for vegetarianism is buildable on Islamic premises, but also to draw attention to important dimensions of this debate that have yet to be addressed. So to this end, I will first describe the mainstream position toward the question of killing for food, then outline and critically assess the arguments used to build a case for vegetarianism on Islam. So I start with the mainstream position. I'm sure everyone knows what it is about, but just like to provide the background for my discussion. Islam is not unique in allowing animals to be killed for food. But among world religions, it may indeed be unique in the level of its resistance to vegetarianism. Scriptural teachings, or at least prevalent readings thereof, are the main reason behind this stance. The Quran and the prophetic tradition do not require Muslims to consume any animal products, but they speak favorably of the consumption of items such as milk and honey, and authorize the consumption of meat once certain ritual requirements in obtaining it are satisfied. The Quran describes milk as a pure substance, palatable to the drinkers, and states that in honey there is healing for humankind. With some exceptions, it also authorizes the consumption of the flesh of ritually killed domestic and hunted animals, as well as sea animals. And here the word ritually killed is important, of course. The prophetic tradition, the hadith, reiterates and further explicates these themes. One prophetic report teaches Muslims to say, I quote this hadith, God bless this food for us and give us something better than it after they consume any type of food, but to say after they drink milk, God bless it for us and give us more of it. This indicates that the Prophet considered milk as the best type of nourishment. The prophetic tradition affirms also that Muhammad liked and consumed honey and that he prescribed it as a treatment for ailments. Animal products are also cited among the staples of heavenly food. In this respect, Islamic tradition actually differs from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Milk and honey run in rivers in the Islamic paradise, and the dwellers of heaven are served meat, including fowl meat, such as they desire, the Quran says. Although there is no reason to assume that in heaven these items will continue to be obtained through animals, in fact, the fact that milk and honey run in rivers, they seem to indicate that they are created directly by God, However, listing them among heavenly delicacies suggests that the Quran seeks to dispel any feelings of guilt and anxiety that may result from the consumption of these items in this world. Or, at least, it indicates that unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Quran does not present vegetarianism as an Edenic ideal to which believers are meant to aspire. Now, While merely authorizing rather than imposing the consumption of animal products, the Quran seems also to prohibit Muslims from tampering with this authorization when it addresses believers saying, "Do not make unlawful the good things that God has made lawful for you, and transgress not, for God does not love transgressors." Exegetical literature explains that this verse was revealed when some of the Prophet's companions decided to abstain from sex and meat and to never lay their sides on a comfortable bed so that they can devote themselves fully to God. Besides this Quranic reminder, their decision reportedly triggered an admonition from the Prophet, who reminded them that he himself avoids such excessive behavior. He enjoys sex and good food, observes fasting on some days yet not on others, and divides his night time between prayers and sleep. Whoever shuns my example, the Prophet cautious in conclusion, has nothing to do with me. Quranic teachings about meat consumption led Richard Falls to conclude that, and now I quote him, "Meat eating might seem to be, except under specific conditions, pleasing to God," end of quote, from which he derives the conclusion that, again, I quote him, "Since it is incumbent upon Muslims to live in a way that is pleasing to God in every detail, not to eat meat, if God wishes us to would constitute an act of infidelity," end of quote. Relatedly, Perlow cites Yahya Monastra, who wonders how a hypothetical Islamic state would enforce rulings about vegetarianism. Would they hold me down, force my mouth open, and shove kebabs down my throat? He asks. These are unjustified readings. Indeed, although the Quran and the Hadith present the consumption of animal products in a positive light, neither of them prescribes reward or punishment for either eating or abstaining from them. These texts merely treat animal products as a blessing from God that Muslims are authorized to enjoy in gratitude. Because of this, the mainstream position holds that Muslims are free to either eat or abstain from meat if they are so inclined, and that neither behavior counts as an act of piety. The consumption of and abstention from meat are thus equally neutral matters from legal and ethical standpoints. However, the tradition disallows any attempt to tamper with this permissibility by criminalizing or otherwise tarnishing meat consumption. Thus, the objectionable part is theological rather than behavioral. While Muslims are free to follow a vegetarian diet if they wish to, they are not allowed to embrace or advocate vegetarianism as an Islamic ideal, or adopt it as an expression of piety, or seek to enforce it on others for the same reason. So this is my reading of, like Islam's position on eating or on killing for food. I now move to the second part of this presentation, where I will engage with these three defenses of vegetarianism. Attempts to build a case for vegetarianism in Islam appeal to several principles, including historical precedent, the health impact of meat consumption, the negative impact of industrial-scale meat production, moral consistency, and moral progress. And I'm going to engage with some of these principles. Although some of these principles have more strength than others, in this section, I try to show that none of them is sturdy enough to serve as an unequivocal foundation for vegetarianism in Islam. So I start with the historical precedent. The historical precedent principle consists of the argument that some Muslims, especially in the pre-modern era, practiced vegetarianism in many cases for reasons of piety, as False maintains. Such vegetarians presumably include the renowned Sufi Rabi'a al-Adawiyya and a few less known or unnamed Sufi figures. The underlying aim of this appeal to Sufism which is presumably Islam's more spiritual, though perhaps less mainstream strand nowadays, could be that if in its purest form Islam is or can be vegetarian friendly, then vegetarianism can be adopted as an expression of piety. More provocatively, Kishi Ali maintains that the Prophet Muhammad himself speculated in 2 instances about foregoing meat consumption out of concern for animals, and complains that such reports are seldom mentioned. The implied point here seems to be that if the Prophet himself considered foregoing meat consumption, then Muslims should perhaps take this a step further and abstain from meat altogether. So the social precedent argument seeks to shed light on a supposedly more vegetarian-friendly side of the tradition that has presumably been obscured or underdeveloped by mainstream orthodoxy. This argument suffers from several flaws. First, Ali's suggestion that the Prophet considered vegetarianism is not only implausible, it is plainly contradicted by numerous scriptural teachings, including the ones I cited earlier. Ali infers her argument from 2 accounts discussed in an article by Giovanni Canova, whereby the Prophet comes to the rescue of 2 animals, a captured doe and an escaping camel, who request his assistance. In the first account, the doe asks the Prophet to untie her so that she can go feed her fawns, promising to be back immediately thereafter. In the second, the camel complains that after a lifetime of service, his owners are planning to slaughter him now that his old age has made him less useful to them. The Prophet helps the doe, then intercedes on her behalf so that she can be permanently freed and reunited with her fawns, and asks the camel's owners to spare his life. Although both accounts highlight the Prophet's concern for non-human animals, neither of them says anything about dietary rules. In fact, the same concern permeates the Prophet's teaching about animals throughout, without nonetheless ever translating in a preference for vegetarianism. Muhammad, for example, taught Muslims that the unjustified killing of animals is a crime punishable by no less than hellfire, and cursed anyone who mutilates or causes an animal to suffer. More positively, he taught Muslims to treat other animals with dignity, care, and compassion, and promised them heavenly reward for any act of kindness toward a non-human creature. While emphasizing these teachings, however, Muhammad unambiguously exempted ritual killing for food as permissible. Consider, for example, the following report, related by the companion Abdullah ibn Umar. So the report says, the Apostle of God said, whoever kills a sparrow or any animal above it for no legitimate reason, God will hold him accountable for it in the hereafter. Someone asked, what would count as a legitimate reason, O Apostle of God? Muhammad said, that he kills then eats it, not that he severs his head then discards it. Indeed, Muhammad reportedly slaughtered animals with his own hands, observed animal sacrifice, and enjoined Muslims to do the same, and consumed meat. Anas ibn Malik is reported to have said, the Prophet, God's peace and blessings be upon him, sacrificed 2 white-horned rams, kabshayn, amlahayn, aqranayn. He slaughtered them with his own hands, ذبحهما بيده. The Prophet's companion, Abdullah ibn Umar, is reported to have said, the Prophet, God's peace and blessings be upon him, lived 10 years in Medina, during which he consistently observed the Eid sacrifice. Muhammad is also reported to have said, on this, meaning the sacrifice day, Yawm al-Nahr, we first pray, then we go home and observe the sacrifice. Abu Huraira is reported to have said, someone gave meat to the Prophet, God's peace and blessings be upon him, so he took the shank, which he liked, and ate from it. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari reported that the Prophet consumed chicken. These and related reports indicate that the Prophet consumed meat and enjoined an animal sacrifice, and that he continued to do this throughout the last 10 years of his life. The weight of this and ample related evidence shows that Ali's inference that the Prophet speculated about foregoing meat consumption from the doe and camel accounts is untenable. Appeals to Sufism are hardly more effective. A close reading of an anecdote cited by Yusuf ibn Ismail al-Nabhani illustrates this point. An-Nabhani, himself a Sufi, tells us of a sheikh who served his Sufi guests meat and bread, but they declined the meal, explaining that they only ate pulses. So the host ate the meal himself and served them pulses. The guests then spent the entire night praying while the host spent the night in bed. In the morning, however, the host outperformed the guests in miracles, something that is interpreted here as a sign of true piety. Although from this anecdote we learn that some Sufis indeed followed a vegetarian diet, the moral of the story is to convey that austerity, of which vegetarianism is treated as a component, is unnecessary and undesirable. This is perhaps why we know of so few vegetarian Sufis by name. Although some Sufis were vegetarian, overall, Sufi literature is not eager to promote vegetarianism as an Islamic or even as a Sufi ideal. It is also worth noting that even the case of Rabi'a al-Adawiyya has been exaggerated in modern literature. For in contrast with the anecdote that attributes her intimacy with wild animals to her supposed vegetarianism, other accounts indicate that she consumed meat. In any case, too little is known about the historical Rabi'a to provide firm knowledge about her diet. It should also be noted that even when it exists, vegetarianism in Sufism is rarely motivated by concern for animals. At best, it is motivated by lack of interest in worldly pleasures, and at worst, by disdain for non-human animals. Falls himself notes that, I quote him, Hellenistically influenced Sufis have sometimes shunned meat eating as nourishing the animal soul. And he cites Abd al-Karim al-Jili, who recommends the avoidance of animal fat because it strengthens animality. This is hardly a position that an animal advocate would want to promote, not only because it is founded on denigrating views of animals, but also because it can compromise their well-being in concrete ways. Such a disdain may spare animals the act of being killed for food, but not necessarily other acts of violence. Surprisingly, however, Falls does not seem to mind this approach. He still presents this type of vegetarianism in a favorable light and recommends it both for its spiritual and health benefits. So now I move to the second principle, which is the health argument. Falls invokes the health benefits of vegetarianism as an additional reason why Muslims should adopt this diet. Although this argument may be strategically useful, deeper scrutiny shows that it is not without problems. Indeed, although personal health and concern for animals are the two most cited motives for the adoption of a vegetarian lifestyle, the two types vary considerably. For whereas one leads to pro-animal attitudes and beliefs, the other to anti-meat attitudes and beliefs. Health vegetarians, Roth Gerber notes, adopt an internal focus addressing desires to sustain good health and avoid illness, and for many of them, the consumption of dead animals is seen as a form of contamination. This attitude is somewhat reminiscent of the ascetic one described earlier in the Sufi tradition, as its main underlying preoccupation is the well-being and the purity of the human being rather than the animal, though in this case with a focus on a body rather than on the soul. The health argument is also empirically flawed. Although a growing body of research continues to highlight the merits of vegetarian diets, the current state of scholarship still holds that foregoing animal products altogether is fraught with health risks. Vegans must notably depend on fortified food for their intake of vitamin B12. And We have many people in the medical field here. I think they can attest to this, I hope at least. Vegans must notably depend on fortified food for their intake of vitamin B12, which is otherwise available only in animal products if they want to avoid a series of health problems, including fatigue, weakness, loss of appetite, depression, poor memory, and difficulty maintaining balance. Though this vitamin is required only in trace amounts and can be stored in the body for several years, foregoing it altogether is harmful. On the other hand, animal products pose health risks only if consumed excessively. As Tony Milligan writes, a vegetarianism of, and Tony Milligan is a vegetarian himself, he's a vegan in fact, but he still writes, a vegetarianism of any defensible sort may have to accept that meat is not nutritionally compromised and that it does us no physical harm to eat it, of course in suitable amounts and with the right preparation. So Milligan rightly notes that the idea that meat per se is physically harmful is, at the very least, ill-informed. So that's about the health principle that is used in, defenses of vegetarian diets. I now move to the third one, which is the impact of industrial meat. False also invokes the detrimental environmental, social, and health impacts of industrial meat production as a further reason why Muslims should opt for vegetarianism. The issue of industrial animal farming deserves special attention, both due to the host of problems associated with it and to Muslims' general failure to address this problem adequately. False highlights the link between industrial livestock production and the problem of world hunger affecting 20% of world population, a problem that is partly linked to the dedication of valuable agricultural land in poor countries to feed crops destined for livestock consumption geared toward more affluent groups. This is in fact only one of the many hidden costs of industrial meat. The industry is also one of the major contributors to environmental degradation. It is fraught with other problems of social inequity, and its products and practices pose serious health threats. At the environmental level, many studies affirm that the meat industry is the largest anthropogenic emitter of greenhouse gases, the largest driver of global deforestation, and the major contributor to air and water pollution. Destruction of ecosystems and endangerment of wildlife are among the numerous ramifications of the industry's environmental impact. These environmental problems are intertwined with social ones. Depriving poor countries of vital agricultural land is not the only form of social inequity for which the industry is responsible. Undercover investigations have also revealed the cruel treatment inflicted on the industry's labor force and the poor conditions where most workers work. The industry often recruits workers from among underprivileged communities, such as immigrants, and hardly guarantees them any protections. Citing the example of Seaboard Corporation, the third largest US hog producer and fourth leading pork processor, Harvey Neo and Jody Emo write that, I quote them, "In the few bits of information available about the company's treatment of workers, it looks as though there is no holiday during the first year, and if someone is injured on the job, the company does everything it can to avoid taking responsibility." The same authors describe the work conditions in meat facilities as follows, and this is a long quotation. They say, "The dust contains feed and fecal particles, feather barbules, skin debris, fungal fragment and spores, bacterial and bacterial fragments, viruses, and particles of litter. This type of dust is typically known as organic dust, since it is derived from materials formed by living organisms. A mysterious foam is plaguing pig operations, trapping methane and causing barn explosions that kill pigs and workers. When you think about the amount of manure, of course filled with antibiotics, hormones, and other chemicals, concentrated in one place, you can only wonder how anyone can work in such a place, never mind having to deal with the miserable animals themselves." This is the end of the quote. Obviously, such conditions are fraught with health risks, but the health repercussions of the industry extend far beyond the work site. The environmental problems discussed earlier create serious health threats for workers, surrounding communities, and consumers. A Pew expert panel notes, for example, that the waste runoff from these production facilities can contaminate groundwater and drinking water supplies, and the toxic gas emissions can be harmful and even fatal to farm workers and surrounding communities. The industry's reliance on growth hormones and antibiotics also poses different serious health threats to consumers. Many studies link the emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, such as dangerous E. coli strains, and resistant types of salmonella to the use of antibiotics in animal agriculture. When one adds to this already troubling record the industry's notorious objectification and abuse of non-human animals, factory farming would seem to be irreconcilable with Islamic doctrines. Indeed, the renowned Muslim scholar Muhammad Hashim Kamali expresses his doubt that the industrial meat can meet Islamic standards of halal due to the industry's use of hormones and antibiotics, and notes that the factory practices may fail to test the compatibility with the Islamic principle of compassion. Although Kamali merely expresses doubt, his analysis indicates that such doubt may in fact be all that is needed to proscribe factory farm products on Islamic grounds, as per the legal maxim that in cases of doubt, prohibition prevails. At the very least, one would have expected these concerns to trigger debates among Muslim religious scholars and other intellectuals and social reformers, but to my knowledge, this debate has not started yet, at least not to a large enough scale to capture the attention of the public and lead to tangible results. So, while fully acknowledging the gravity of this problem, it seems obvious that a case against industrial animal products does not constitute a case against all animal products. This is, of course, not to claim that conventional animal husbandry is innocent of animal abuse. However, there is a difference between a system that is inherently problematic, which is the industrial production of animals, and one that is potentially problematic. Leaving aside the controversial question of killing for food, conventional animal husbandry can be and has been conducted in a way that is consistent with non-human animals' interests, at least in my own opinion. Considering the fundamental differences between the two types of farming, industrial farming and conventional farming, the two should not therefore be conflated into one. I now move to my last principle, which is the principle of moral progress. This argument consists of the idea that even if Islam allowed killing for food in the past, moral progress, both at the empirical and moral levels, warrants the reversal of this position. False maintains that for early Muslims, foregoing the consumption of meat was probably unfeasible, considering their limited dietary options, but modern economies have lifted such pressures. Perlow does not share the view that killing for food is ever dictated by necessity, blaming the practice instead on humans' moral shortcomings. However, she notes that, and I quote her here, the drive to fulfill sympathy and achieve inner peace has led to more and more benevolent policies, as evidenced by the abandonment of slavery, despotism, racism, and sexism, end of quote. Such sympathy, she demands, should now be extended to non-human animals. The argument about moral progress poses many problems. Although many philosophers in the West seem to accept the proposition that humanity's moral state is now better than what it used to be, many admit the difficulty of establishing this proposition in unequivocal terms and acknowledge that this proposition will remain a point of controversy. This is firstly because morality, as all ethics philosophers would probably grant, is at least in part socially constructed. The debate usually is about whether ethics is an independent system, it's natural, we just discover it, or is it something that we develop ourselves? And this debate was also part of Islamic tradition among the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari, for example. And the point will probably never be fully established. The fact that many have the impression that humanity is currently more moral than it used to be can thus simply be an expression of cultural or historical chauvinism. As Jess Prince explains, from the present, we always seem to have better values than we had in the past for the trivial reason that we embrace our present values and no longer embrace past values. A second difficulty with the moral progress principle pertains to the evaluation tools. For example, in deciding whether we have achieved moral progress, would it be enough to look at the normative level, or do we also need to take into consideration the lived reality? One could, for example, argue that although the institution of slavery has been abolished, many practices that are traditionally associated with slavery still survive. I mean, this does not mean, of course, that the fact that at the normative level slavery is abolished is not meaningful. It is meaningful. But it's not, you know, like the discussion, I believe, should be wider than that. The normative level is an important dimension, but the empirical one is also quite important. A third difficulty consists of the colonial undertones of this principle. After all, the moral improvement of indigenous populations was one of the important items on the colonizers' agenda and can still be sensed in political and philosophical debates, including ones dealing with animal and environmental ethics. Indeed, through her lack of attempt to gain even a modest glimpse into the rationales that inform animal ethics in non-Western traditions, Perlo's position echoes the one that characterized generations of Western colonizers. So Perlo, you know, like she takes it for granted that, you know, like we are now more moral than we used to be, and this is based on, you know, like certain moral philosophies in the West. Which, I mean, it's not like I'm not contesting that. In fact, I'm not a specialist in that to contest this idea. But what I contest here is that there isn't even the least interest in understanding first why other communities have, you know, accepted killing for food, like the principle of killing for food. And this lack of interest in understanding the other's point of view, I believe, is, you know, like something that characterized colonial discourse for ages, and it has not disappeared, and it still plagues even the animal discourse nowadays. Though less problematic, False's position that economic changes warrant a revision of rulings pertaining to the permissibility of killing for food is not without difficulties either. Although modern economies have probably secured an unprecedented level of affluence to the largest number of people, such affluence is neither equally experienced nor is it without environmental cost. Commenting on this point, Catherine Osborne writes that modern defenses of vegetarianism generally assume an affluent readership consisting of the supermarket consumers in a Western post-industrial economy. In such circumstances, she notes, it might make sense to claim that people should choose not to eat meat because vegetarian alternatives are always available to them, and meat is not essential for human well-being. Indeed, healthy enough vegetarian alternatives are not readily available to all. Even in a society as affluent as modern Britain, note Simon Fairley, Richard Young, and Pat Thomas, a vegan or vegetarian diet can start to make less sense if one leaves the city and moves to a farm, especially if the farm consists mainly of the UK's most abundant crop, which is grass. Less affluent societies, of which Muslims form a substantial part, often lack the technology and financial means needed for the production or obtainment of sufficiently diversified and fortified food items to meet basic health requirements. For many, diets inclusive of animal products are not simply a matter of satisfying one's palate, they are indeed a matter of health. Perhaps even more problematically, the same affluence that has enabled a growing number of people to enjoy healthy and satisfying vegetarian meals is also closely intertwined with environmental problems. As more nations join the club of the privileged, the ecological footprint and the stress on Earth resources become more straining. And what I'm arguing is, you know, like for a vegetarian diet to be healthy enough, it cannot depend, in most cases, it will not depend only on local products. You have also, for example, to import products from other parts. And all of this has ecological repercussions linked to it. And this needs to be taken into consideration when we discuss vegetarianism. The impact of these stresses extends to innumerable non-human animals, especially non-domestic ones. So like through this environmental impact, it's not just like on the earth, it's actually on animals themselves. It's on the very animals that this discourse seeks to defend and protect. This said, the proposition that changes at the empirical level may call for a revision of religious rulings is neither unprecedented nor inherently problematic. So I will not call this moral progress. It's just, adjustment to present day conditions or constraints, in fact. For example, considering that the observance of the sacrifice ritual, including during the pilgrimage to Mecca, requires most animals to be imported from distant locations in conditions that clearly conflict with prophetic teachings pertaining to their treatment, it may be worthwhile to reconsider aspects of this ritual. After all, this is not the first time that the tradition has been called upon to adapt to emerging constraints, and the call was answered frequently enough to show that this path is worth exploring. Before going this path, however, several points must be addressed. While discussions of vegetarianism in Islam, so now I move to the future direction, what needs to be done before, if we want to really establish a fruitful conversation in this respect. While discussions of vegetarianism in Islam have pertinently pointed out and challenged the anthropocentric assumptions that inform many justifications for killing for food in Islam, they have applied little to no scrutiny to the principle of vegetarianism and the theories that defend it. As mentioned earlier, one point that needs to be weighed carefully before seeking to reinterpret the tradition is the role of affluence in this debate. Besides the environmental dimension of this question, one needs also to consider how the potential adoption of vegetarianism among the more affluent can affect the image of the less so. So if vegetarianism is accepted, for example, in the West as the norm, like the West can afford being vegetarian, there is no need to kill for food because there is fortified food. So the West can become vegetarian. The rest of the world cannot, understandably, because they cannot have like healthy enough vegetarian diets. But isn't there a risk eventually to lead to the image of like this pure ethical West and savage non-ethical rest of the world? Right? So, there is this risk which needs to be taken into consideration. I'm not saying that this is necessarily something that will happen, but the possibility is there and it needs to be explored. So, although many would now grant that when there is no genuine need for killing for food, when there is a genuine need, killing for food is not ethically problematic. If this practice becomes associated only with the poor, there is eventually the risk that high morality will become linked with the affluence, whereas the poor would be perceived as the savage or less ethical. Defenses of vegetarianism in the Islamic context should also spell out their own conception or their conception of the vegetarian model that they seek to promote and address the complications associated with each model. Obviously, an ovo-lacto vegetarian diet, a vegetarian diet that accepts the consumption of milk and eggs but no meat, still depends on a system that requires animals to be killed. In this case, the animals will not be killed, like the vegetarian person will not eat the meat itself, but they're still involved in a system that depends on killing. Others are going to eat that meat, not the vegetarian, but the animals are dying. But even a vegan diet has a cost in life. The vegetarian ideal may thus be elusive or at least not as innocent of killing as many think. A vegan diet still has, like many insects, for example, are killed in vegan diets. And it has been argued that a vegan diet actually has a higher cost in killing if we take into consideration all the small animals, like like, I don't know, mice, snakes, a variety of animals that we tend to think less about. So this also needs to be taken into consideration. Another complication pertains to the institution of domestication, which is closely tied to the practice of killing for food. Should this institution be abolished, as conventional animal rights demand, or should it be remodeled in a way that would do away with killing, as some political theorists have proposed? If the latter, how specifically? If we just want to reform domestication, how specifically? So this dimension of the discourse is there in the secular context, but defenses of vegetarianism in the Islamic context have not tackled this topic. I think they should, if they want to have a serious conversation. So if the latter, how specifically? And if the former, then what about pastoral and farming societies that lack technologies and other resources? In the secular discourse, someone like Gary Francione, for example, and many others are now saying that domestication is a type of slavery. It has been, it's inherently exploitative of non-human animals, and therefore we need to abolish domestication altogether. Of course, even this is highly problematic. Like, how are we going to do it? First of all, when we do this, it is going to have a cost on animals. We are going to eventually, so Gary Francione says we don't kill the animals, but we we control their reproductivity. They should not reproduce anymore. Isn't this a type of violence on the bodies and interference with their well-being, like frustration of their reproductive desires? So what I'm saying here, it's not like I'm not excluding any of this from the debate. I'm just saying these are important parts of the debate. We need to tackle them. We cannot just ignore them or, push them under the rug and pretend that they're not there. Finally, defenses of vegetarianism need to acknowledge the anthropocentric character of this principle and many of the theories that defend it. This consists, for example, of the problem of extensionism common to prominent animal ethics theory, such as utilitarianism, deontology, Aristotelianism, and contractarianism, whereby moral consideration is allocated to other creatures based on their level of similarity to humans. So here, I think all these theories about, like with the exception of environmentalist animal theory, which accepts killing for food, other theories which either totally oppose killing for food or, like utilitarianism, it does not oppose it altogether, but to some extent, they all have the human being as the center. So it's like, like we start with paying attention to the well-being of non-human being, and then we start enlarging the circle to include more animals, but those animals who get included are those animals who are more like us. Domestic animals deserve more attention because they are physically closer to us. We are more attached to them emotionally. Size-wise, they're big enough so that we can look in their faces, we can relate to their pain, but we do not extend the same attention, for example, to smaller animals, to insects, for example. And there are even arguments that insects do not feel pain. This is something that is advocated by animal rights advocates. This is exactly the same Cartesian discourse that was conducted centuries ago. Like the exclusion of animals from moral consideration. Isn't the exclusion of insects another sign of anthropocentrism? So this human centrism of the animal rights discourse itself is something that needs to be addressed. So this is I guess, like what I wanted to argue today. Thank you very much for bearing with me and for listening to me.